What is up, and welcome back to Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. As always, I am your host, Brandon Silvers. Hope y'all are doing well. You'll be doing even better if you subscribe, rate, review, and share this show with your friends. Tell a friend to tell a friend, because I've got some exciting stuff coming your way soon, including today's episode. So let's get into it. So we just had the NBA draft, and I still get excited about it. And I've been keeping up with it ever since I was little, and I would take my basketball almanacs to school to read during our breaks. But as I was watching the draft, I realized that excitement comes from a different place now. You see, now it represents the official beginning of the NBA offseason. And the NBA has an offseason unlike any other pro sports league, in my opinion, because not only do big names get moved all the time, but NBA players love being in the spotlight and love being petty in the spotlight, which is another reason why I should have been in the NBA. In the days leading up to the draft and during the draft is when a lot of the big blockbuster moves happen, and that's become the focus of draft night, while the actual selection of players has become secondary. But how did we get here? Well, let's go back and take a look at how the NBA draft as an event has evolved since I started paying attention to it. The year is 1996. The Bulls just beat the Seattle Supersonics to win their first title since MJ came back from playing baseball, and they won a record 72 regular season games in the process, and I was crushed by my Houston Rockets' failure to three-peat. I needed something to look forward to. Enter the 1996 NBA draft. Of course, we now know how amazing of a draft class it ended up being. Historic. Right up there with 1984 and 2003. And with this being my first time paying attention to a draft, it probably set my standards a little bit high. But what were the overall themes? First off, youth, but not too much. There wasn't a senior drafted until Kerry Kittles went number 8 to the New Jersey Nets. Compare this to the 1992 draft where Shaq went number 1 overall, and all the first round picks were at least juniors. In 1996, you were still seeing upperclassmen in the mix, but youth wasn't a problem at the top of the draft unless it was too young. Now, what was too young? High schoolers. Kevin Garnett had gone number 5 overall the previous season out of high school, and he went on to be named to the all-rookie second team, but the league was still a little bit skittish when it came to high schoolers, and as a result, Kobe Bryant fell to the 13th pick, and Columbia's own Jermaine O'Neal was picked 17th by the Portland Trail Blazers. Now we know how that turned out because my dog is named Kobe and not Samaki Walker. The youth movement wasn't the only shift in this draft though. Teams also started drafting European players in the first round. There were 4 selected in 96, including Peja Stojakovic and Zydrunas Ilgauskas. A European player who hadn't played college ball in the U.S. had only been drafted in the first round of the NBA draft twice prior to this year. In case you're ever at a trivia night, those two were Arvydas Sabonis and flopper extraordinaire Vlade Divac. Now, while the draft was certainly in the midst of a youth movement, it was still very college-centric. Even the young college guys being drafted were still household names. Allen Iverson was the number 1 overall pick. He was a first-team All-American. Marcus Camby went number 2 overall. He was College Player of the Year under Coach Cal at UMass. If you tuned in for the draft, you knew the players being drafted. Conference Players of the Year, All-Americans, guys who had gone on deep March Madness runs, known commodities. And this mixture of a handful of high school guys and European guys sprinkled in with known commodities from college basically made up the draft until we entered the next era in 2001, when the high schoolers and the European guys started battling out for the top spot, and the known commodities from college took a backseat to them. So what led to this shift in 2001? Well, first of all, by this point, the high school guys had started to show that they could develop without the detour of going to college. Kobe just came off a season where he averaged 29, 6, and 5 and looked every bit of the heir apparent to MJ as he helped Shaq lead the Lakers to their second straight title. KG, the OG high schooler from the Baby Brandon era, had developed into one of the best power forwards in the game on both ends of the court, and Jermaine O'Neal was finally getting some real playing time in Indiana and averaging 13 and 10 with 3 blocks. Then you had the European guys. Peja had just had a ridiculous season for the Kings where he averaged 20 points on an absurd 40% from 3 at 6'10". At the time, a 6'10" guy playing on the perimeter was more of a gimmick than anything, so him actually having this level of success was incredible. And the guys who came after them were killing it as well. I mean, not everybody was a Dirk or a T-Mac, but the guys who were great were so great that it was certainly worth the risk to draft them and see what could happen. On top of all that, the known commodities from college were looking worse and worse. Don't get me wrong, you could still find fantastic players, but the 2000 draft was absolutely awful. Let's take a quick look at some of those first-round picks out of college that year who played over 500 games in the NBA and averaged 10 points per game over the course of their career. We got Jamal Crawford, not bad, all-time great sixth man, but not great yet. All right, number 1 overall pick, Kenyon Martin. Number 1 overall pick, Kenyon Martin? That sounds weird. Desmond Mason, Morris Peterson, Mike Miller, Quentin Richardson. That's the list. Now, I'm not going to call them garbage. Great role players there, don't get me wrong. But also, on the other hand, whoop-de-damn-do. Think about it. You're an NBA GM. Would you rather have Marcus Fizer at the 4th pick? 3 years at Iowa State, Conference Player of the Year, and an All-American. Great college resume. Couple of solid years in the league as a backup before getting injured and washing out. Or would you rather take a chance on a high school kid with raw potential who you can develop at the NBA level, or a European kid with the same, but he's also been playing pro ball overseas since he was 16? That 2000 draft basically answered that question for a lot of organizations, so in 2001, the draft looked more like a high school graduation. 4 high school players in the top 8 picks, including 3 of the first 4 picks. Now, who these guys developed into played a big role in how future drafts turned out, but this new era was here, so let's talk about that. At this point, the NBA was still very much a big man's game, but we're starting to see some of that KG, Chris Webber, Dirk, Peja influence too. The number 1 overall pick is now infamous, Kwame Brown, born right here in Charleston, grew up in Brunswick, Georgia, 6'11", traditional post player, first high schooler ever drafted number 1 overall. Obviously never lived up to that number 1 pick status, but he did play in the league forever, so he must have been doing something right because they'll run you out of here if you're trash on the court and a problem off of it. The number 2 pick was Tyson Chandler out of Dominguez High School in California. He was always in Slam magazine, and he had a respectable career, winning Defensive Player of the Year award. He won a ring as well. And what's wild is they were talking about him being a small forward at 7 feet tall. He was hyped up as like the next evolution of Kevin Garnett, but he never played like that at all when he got to the league. Then you had Hall of Famer Pau Gasol, drafted 3rd out of Europe, and another high schooler in Eddie Curry, drafted 4th. Eddie was supposed to be the next version of Shaq. We must have all been on crack cocaine. He peaked with a 19-7 season on a terrible Knicks team, and he was rarely in shape. The high school foreign player movement was in full effect the next couple years, with Yao, LeBron, and Dwight Howard being drafted number 1 overall, in that order, and high schoolers Amari Stoudemire and LeBron winning Rookie of the Year. That Dwight Howard draft in 2004 was the peak of the youth movement and also its downfall. I told y'all about reading about Tyson Chandler in Slam magazine back in the day, and they actually had a high school section, and they would give one senior each year a column to write about how their year was going, and they weren't the only ones. High schoolers had become just as much of a known commodity as college players when it came to media and hype. Unfortunately, they were all playing against different levels of competition, since high school was still mostly a local thing, outside of a handful of exceptions like Oak Hill Academy, so the known part of known commodity was in thick-ass quotation marks. LeBron was on another level, but we knew more about him than any college guy ever by the time he was drafted. And even the elite high school guys who went to college, like Carmelo, we knew a lot about. The thinking seemed to be that if you went to college, it was because you weren't good enough to go straight to the NBA, and if you stayed in college too long, there must be something wrong with your game. And the second part of this still exists, but the first doesn't. In 2004 is why. While Dwight was great from the jump and you had plenty of other guys who had made the leap and been amazing, you had way more high school guys who had been bust. And that's a problem under any circumstances, but it's more so if you don't understand the risk that you're taking by drafting them. And it seemed like GMs started buying into the hype and not seeing the risks as these guys got more publicity and couldn't see those thick-ass quotation marks around the known and known commodity, and they started having real problems. If a guy's good enough to go from high school to the NBA, he's supposed to end up being a star, not a role player like Kwame Brown or a solid rotation guy with a questionable basketball IQ like J.R. Smith or Josh Smith, and certainly not a bust like Dudi Ebe or Robert Swift. And it was even harder to develop these guys because it was sink or swim at the NBA level because the G League existed, but it wasn't used as a place to develop players, which is ironic because back then it was the D League and the D stood for developmental. While I'm on the topic, calling it the G League after Gatorade is dumb. Anyways, the high schoolers were making GMs look stupid. They were costing them their jobs. They were causing franchises to stall out. The NBA had to protect them from themselves, so they changed the rules so that 2005 was the last year players could come directly from high school into the NBA. The end of an era. But wait, we still had the overseas guys, right? Yes, but that hype was dying down too. Why? Well, for every Dirk or Peja, you had a handful of Darko Milicic's or Nikolaj Skitishvili's who had done nothing. Drafting an international man of mystery high usually meant you'd either get a bust or a solid role player at best. And if that's what you're looking for, then it makes way more sense to just draft a 4-year college guy who can come in and do that immediately, and don't waste 2 or 3 years waiting for a guy to come over and develop into that. If he even decides to come over at all, shout out to Fran Vasquez, who the Magic drafted 11th in 2005, and they still haven't seen him. The final nail in the coffin for the overseas player being overrated was 2007 number 1 overall pick, Andrea Bargnani. Fun fact, he was actually the first European player ever to be drafted first overall. Okay, I mean, it's not a fun fact to Raptors fans, but whatever. Okay, how about this one? The Sopranos aired its final episode weeks after Andre's rookie season. Both Italian, that's fun. Look, I don't want to say he was terrible. I mean, he could score. He averaged the quietest 21 points per game ever for the Raptors one year. But I don't know if we've ever had a softer player in the league, which had to come as a shock to the Raptors organization if they were big Sopranos fans. I mean, we think of Anthony Davis as soft today because he's always wincing in pain and rolling around on the court. Take that aspect of AD and throw in a complete and utter fear of defending and rebounding along with disappearing in every single meaningful game. That's Andrea Bargnani. From that point on, and with the new rules in place regarding high school players, the league slipped into a mixture of college guys and overseas guys, leaning way more in favor of the college players, particularly one-and-done guys. If you had a great freshman season, congratulations. You're a top NBA draft pick. Greg Oden, Kevin Durant, Derrick Rose, Michael Beasley. I mean, it didn't always work out, clearly, but those aren't awful names, and they weren't at the time. Hindsight's 2020, but Oden looked good when he was healthy, and Beasley was unstoppable at Kansas State, so you had to take him there. Overall, these drafts actually weren't terrible. They would mix in some guys who had stayed longer too, so you basically knew most of the players being drafted. You would watch them play, and the overseas guys weren't complete mysteries either anymore. There's really nothing notable enough about this era in terms of the actual picks. Instead, this next era is defined by something off the draft board. Woj. I can't remember exactly when I got on Twitter. I want to say it was 2008, and it was simply a way to connect with people all across the globe in short bursts. Hashtags mattered. It added a community feel to everything you did. I'd be scrolling and tweeting away, watching sporting events and trashy reality TV shows. Shout out to Catfish and 16 and Pregnant. This was the era of MTV, after music videos, but before 24-hour ridiculousness marathons. Anyways, the draft was one of these things that we'd all tweet about together, and Adrian Wojnarowski was at Yahoo Sports, and he picked up on this, and he started live tweeting picks before they came in, taking the surprise out of the announcement. It cut into the enjoyment of the draft because you couldn't miss his picks if you tried on Twitter, so you could either not be on Twitter and be surprised, but what's the point of being surprised if you can't fire off a hot take, or you could be on Twitter but take all of the suspense out of the draft because you knew what was coming before it was announced. Woj announced leading up to the draft this year that he wasn't going to leak picks, and he stuck to that for the most part unless he was announcing a trade or whatever. I guess he wanted to focus all of his attention on being awful on TV. I mean, did you see him? Perfection is overrated, and I know live TV is terrible, but you can't be so bad that it's distracting from what you're saying. But Woj is. Maybe get off Twitter every now and then and get with a media coach. And it's too late to reverse the damage he's done to the draft because he's ruined that surprise aspect of it, and he's spawned a competitor who does the same in Shams Charania. Right before this year's draft, Shams tweeted about the Hornets not being sold on Brandon Miller with the second pick. Since you can bet on everything now, the betting line shifted considerably towards Scoot Henderson going number 2 on that news, which turned out to be wrong. Sports betting companies made a lot of money off people losing that bet on Scoot Henderson going number 2 after the Shams tweet. Wouldn't it be wild if someone who was paid a lot of money by a sports gambling company leaked some fake news that helped his company make a lot more money? Let's say someone was paid by one of these sports gambling companies and they were also seen as one of the top 2 newsbreakers in the NBA, and they leaked some news that people trusted because of their reputation, but that news turned out to be wrong in a way that benefited the company that was giving them paychecks. That would be wild, right? I mean, surely that would never happen. Anyways, so Woj was at Yahoo Sports, made the move to ESPN. They tried to get him to stop leaking picks because they're the ones broadcasting the draft. And if he's tweeting out picks, then people might be less inclined to tune in. So what did Woj do? He passive-aggressively started using euphemisms to announce the picks beforehand. Technically, he wasn't announcing anything. He was merely saying things like, the Portland Trailblazers are laser-focused on so-and-so with the 17th pick. ESPN eventually gave up and was like, all right, whatever, leak the picks. But now he says he doesn't see the value in doing it. Well, if you don't see it now, then did it ever really exist? I have many issues with breaking news guys like Woj and Shams, but I won't talk about them all here. I myself love knowing things other people don't know, so I get that aspect of it. And we need people to break news, so I get that too. But leaking draft picks isn't doing that at all, really. You're just saying something that we're all about to find out in a minute or two. It's the reporting equivalent of commenting first under a YouTube video. It's lame as hell. You're not unearthing some fact that would otherwise not be known. We actually have a time when we're all going to know. So in conclusion, fuck Woj and fuck Shams. Now we have moved into yet another era for the draft. This hit me as I was watching it and I realized I don't know who the hell any of these guys are. If you know me, you know I watch college basketball. I covered March Madness on here, and I watched as much of it as humanly possible while still remaining a productive member of society. I have enough knowledge about college basketball to hold a relatively intelligent conversation about it, yet I have no clue who these kids are. Are their names familiar? Vaguely. But as far as being draft prospects, what are we talking about? The one rule for college players that has always been the same since I started paying attention to the draft was that you had to have done something notable while you were playing in college. I'm talking putting up big numbers, conference player of the year, All-American, stuff like that. With all that's changed throughout the draft, high schoolers, no high schoolers, overseas players, no overseas players, upperclassmen, one and done, that had been the constant. And now it's not. Now you just have to show enough potential to develop into an NBA player. You don't even have to be the number 1 or number 2 guy on your college team. This seems to have started in the 2020 draft, so maybe COVID had something to do with it, and there are a couple of factors at play here. First of all, the men's college game and the NBA game are further apart than they used to be in terms of playing style. It's never been a 1-to-1 conversion, but with the way the NBA has evolved, it's become a lot like comparing college football to the NFL. Just because a guy is good at one level doesn't mean it's going to translate to the other and vice versa. Also, high schoolers have more options than just going to college for one season and turning pro. You used to see guys like Brandon Jennings or Emmanuel Mudiay go overseas to satisfy the requirement of that 1-year post-high school graduation rule the league implemented to stop players from coming in straight from high school. That's a hell of a thing to do though. 18 years old, now you have to go to a country you have no clue about to go play ball. You get paid, but as we've seen, that style of play might not necessarily translate to the NBA either. But now you have more options here in the US for these kids to do that. The G League, Overtime Elite, they're making money, they're in a pro environment, they don't have to worry about going to a new country, adjusting to a new culture, going to class, anything like that. Just developing their games. And of course, those games and those leagues are less likely to be on TV than college games. So someone like me and the average fan is less likely to watch those guys play, especially if my decision is between watching that or a college game. I love March Madness, so I'm going to watch college basketball because college basketball leads me into March Madness. I simply don't know what the G League or Overtime Elite stuff leads to. Do they even have brackets? I also don't know where we go after this era. We really don't have enough information on this current era yet to know how well it works, and we also don't know how NIL will affect players attending college in the first place or staying in school longer, which would obviously help us know them better. It's been fascinating to see the progression of the draft. It used to be such a player-centric event. Now, I don't really care about who's getting drafted. I'm watching to see the other stuff, the trades, the free agency speculation. The draft itself is a secondary event and is treated as such during coverage, like when ESPN brought in their famed draft analyst, Fat Joe, to give his thoughts on it on their ABC broadcast. Look, I'm not one to gatekeep sports takes. Let them fly. But have you ever in your life said to yourself, I wonder what Fat Joe thinks about the 15th pick in the NBA draft? If you're dead set on bringing in New York rappers, Cameron and Mace are right there. Is this the oldest I've ever sounded? Quite possibly. It's time for my Metamucil. So this has been another episode of Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. Appreciate you watching, listening, rating, reviewing, subscribing, and sharing. And I will catch you next week.